Great that we can meet on such short notice. Really happy to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Well, I'm retired now, so I have lots of time.
That's great. That's great. So no, because it's sort of you have a sort of a bit of a similar profile to. I'm working now with Bernardo Kastrup. I don't know if you know his name.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, I think I was wondering because I think you wrote when you started writing Quantum Buddhism. That's already a decade ago, right? And I think Kastrup was at that moment not that. I don't know if he was publishing already, but I was wondering because I think otherwise you would have, I think, quoted him as well in your book.
Of course, you see, I knew nothing about him, and it was only quite recently I discovered Bernardo Kastrup. He wasn't on the horizon at all before 2010, as far as I can remember.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things I find so, how can I say this, ironically bizarre, is that the kind of thing Kastrup is doing, I was doing 30 years ago.
It is.
I was at University of Sussex. I was in the religious studies department. Under the head of the department was an incredible woman called Pratima Bose, the only female Hindu philosopher in the West, head of religious studies department. And we used to have symposiums on a similar kind of theme, and I gave talks. I ran a course on science and Buddhism 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. No, and that was.
But of course, there was no internet, so people didn't know you were doing it. Apart from, I took a wrong direction in many ways. Routledge Keegan Paul wanted to publish my thesis.
Yeah, and how has it gone since? I mean, is your book being? What has the response been at large? I mean, have you sort of the traction it gave?
Oh, I'm shocked at the fact it hasn't made the kind of impact I would have expected it to make. Now, I published it 12 years ago, and I think about 2 years ago, maybe a bit less, a very highly qualified quantum physicist, a friend of mine called Mike Roker now, got in contact with me, and he's very knowledgeable about Eastern philosophies as well, and a Buddhist practitioner. He said, "I don't understand it, Graham. I've read just about everything there is to read in this field of studies, and there's nothing like your work. Nobody has written to the extent of detail and precision. How come nobody knows about your work?" And I said, "I don't know. I've contacted people, but they don't want to know." And this I find very strange.
Yeah. I was also, because like I emailed you, I was struck by sort of like I said, I'm in the midst of reading. So also for now, I haven't written your full book, but it struck me as sort of almost like an encyclopedia for me to just, and that's just great after having read a book like Quantum Enigma. And so it wonders me too. And I do think that maybe in the future it will sort of get that attention as sort of a standard work on all of this. And I guess that's in a way, but there's this difficulty, and I'm discussing this openly with Bernardo as well. So I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm super fascinated by all of this. Having a Christian religious background, I departed from that, and but all of this fascinates me. Like when I got in touch with Bernardo and Idealism, I made a documentary about it for public television in the Netherlands. Ever since, this feels as a sort of a calling to sort of get it out there, you know.
Sure.
But, yeah. So I
watched your documentary. It's very good. I liked it.
Thanks. Yeah. And it was, in a sense, I tried maybe to tell a bit too much, and the whole search now. So Bernardo and I started talking, and I heard that he said that he had this foundation set up, Essentia, and we thought, okay, the best we can bring the world is have sort of this high-end documentary series about all of this. and this conversation I'm having with you, I hope that it can be sort of input for me, and maybe to also explore just further how we can maybe collaborate on it. But always there's this sort of difficulty in what I see bringing together sort of the more hardcore idealism of Bernardo, which is very much analytical, and it doesn't want to like stay away from spirituality, but Bernardo is he's very cautious, you know, because of I think the problem with quantum mysticism, right? The label it has gotten. So
it's very easy to give what seems to me to be an overinflated view of the ease with which people can access primordial consciousness. If you read some books by sort of New Age authors, and I'll go into one who's plagiarized me, you would think just reading a book of your, you know, bedtime chocolate for a few nights and next day you'll be enlightened. It's just nonsense, you know. Yeah. As I say in one of my talks recently, Tibetan, for example, Buddhist meditators went to caves for years. So the idea that in the 20th century suddenly we're going to be able to just read a few books and be enlightened seems to me to be implausible.
Yeah,
it takes a bit more effort than that.
Yeah, I can fully agree there. And if you had to give sort of a bird's eye view, I mean, you are in this now for decades. Where did it sort of go wrong? The impression I have is that like early quantum fathers were much more, as it seems to me, also philosopher interested in Eastern thought. And then we got the whole sort of shut up and calculate movement in physics. And in the 70s, of course, New Age movement. But the link between quantum mechanics and Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, how did that develop, and where are we at the moment in sort of just openly exploring it?
Where did it develop? There was a group of physicists called the Fundamental Physics Group. Have you heard of them?
Yeah.
I mean, they were that was Fritjof Capra, Sirag, Jack Savati, Henry Stanley.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Nick Herbert. Yeah, I mean, these people were the people who investigated, especially non-locality, wasn't it? Their big thing, I think. They looked into the possible links with telepathy and stuff like that. Fritjof Capra was the first book really to explore this kind of territory. Although I think if you go back into the 19th century, there were philosophers who were interested in idealism, such as Myers. There was a general decision at the end of the 19th century amongst a certain group of anti-religious zealots, shall we say, to put the boot into mysticism. I don't know if you're aware of this. T.H. Huxley was one of them. Supporters of Darwin, of course. Partly because I think of what was seen as, what should we say, corruption within the church, and maybe overinflation of claims within the church. I mean, Darwin was hailed as, you know, sort of the saviour of rational thought at that time. So, and that feeling amongst mainstream scientific community has persisted. And I'm writing a book, this book here, Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal, going into the fact there is now this complete divide between quantum mystics and then the hardcore anti-quantum mystic cabal of physicists, scientists and biologists who hate the idea, and they won't have there's no kind of meeting ground, it seems.
And whereas, I mean, 100 years ago, that was different, right? When quantum mechanics was first discovered, and the quantum
Yeah,
fathers,
indeed,
yeah.
indeed. But then there was a reaction against that. Yeah, Bohr had. See, Bohr is a very difficult figure to pin down, because although he did say some stuff which was kind of quantum mysticy, kind of at the same time, he would say things like, "Well, we mustn't bring it into physics." Believe it or not, I mean, I only recently discovered this. You will see people say, "Well, Bohr said, this is reminiscent of what people were saying in the East." But the bit they don't tell you is Bohr also said underneath in his next sentence, "But that doesn't mean we must import such views into physics." And when you investigate this debate carefully, you will find there are people like John Wheeler, the great John Wheeler, who would say very mystical things like, we manifest the world backwards in time through our observations. And then in the next sentence would say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. Stones can do it." And you think, what? And you suddenly see there's this kind of saying something and then taking it back. You find exactly the same thing happens in a recent book by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow. They clearly state that observations backwards in time create histories of the universe from quantum potentialities. But Leonard Mlodinow, if he says, well, consciousness is involved, and he has done this in a debate with Deepak Chopra, he's come out and said, well, we don't even know what consciousness is. And then you think, well, then why did you assent to writing this book? And I've got the book here, I can show you, I've debated people, no, they couldn't have said that. So I've got the book, they've said it. People don't read. This is what you come across. People have opinions, especially on YouTube, in the comments. They have opinions they're not entitled to because they haven't read.
Mm.
So this goes back to why did I research quantum Buddhism? It was because I was very inspired by people like B. Alan Wallace. His books are brilliant. But you would find that people like, I think it was Lee Smolin, people like this anyway, or maybe David Albert, would say, I'm not going to take any of this nonsense seriously because, really, it's so impressionistic. And I thought, well, it's true, actually. Although he makes his statements, he doesn't prove them with precision. So I thought my task was to prove this stuff with precision, which is why I started writing quantum Buddhism.
And in which I think, but you have definitely achieved that. And you just named Lee Smolin, and in your book you actually say, which I found also fascinating, that he says the moment I start talking with my colleagues over lunch about the meaning of the Schrödinger equation or the meaning of quantum theory, we get fierce debates, and it's best to stop that and just start calculating. So is that sort of like where, I don't know how to put it, but this ambiguity, I think anyone who seriously is in the field of physics and working with this has to face this one way or another, right? You cannot sort of put it under the carpet.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Rosenblum and Kuttner say this in their book, Quantum Enigma. They quite clearly say that, I think they say about 1950s, 1960s, there was this kind of, and even Roger Penrose says the same thing, there is this kind of academic pressure not to get involved in speculations about the foundations of quantum theory. There are people who are trying to change this now, but in general, they want to change it in favor of a materialist conception of quantum physics. If you wanted to claim things like consciousness was involved, you were likely to be derided. And there's a very good example of this, for example, with Jim Al-Khalili. You probably don't know about this.
No.
Now, Jim Al-Khalili wrote with John Joe McCracken an excellent book. I think it's called Biology at the Edges or something like this. I've got it somewhere. In which they talk about quantum processes in biology. And he has clearly stated that they were going to publish this stuff a decade earlier. But they didn't publish because they were persuaded not to by academic pressure, saying this was woo-woo.
And this is
So
rigorous science. And when it was
Yes.
published, it was peer-reviewed and regarded as
Well, you
solid.
see, in the 10 years since they were told not to publish because it was woo-woo and nonsense, the evidence stacked up. The evidence is in photosynthesis, in bird migration, quantum processes in the eye of the bird, navigating, smell, it's a quantum because the evidence just stacked up to show that what they were claiming 10 years before was true, they were able now to publish because the evidence was irrefutable. But the evidence was there 10 years earlier, it's just that people weren't prepared to accept it. Now, the interesting thing is, at the same time as Jim Al-Khalili tells this story about he was dissuaded from publishing, he will put the intellectual boot into people who think that, any psychic phenomena are involved. So he's still doing exactly the same to people today, as was done to him 10 years earlier. And you think, do people ever learn?
But this is all also very funny and ironic. But it brings me back to sort of like a core question I wanted to discuss with you, and that's sort of the materialist prejudice or the materialist paradigm we're in and how strong it is. So one of the questions I have, do you, with all your knowledge of quantum mechanics, think that upholding materialism is even maybe a false idea or untenable? It's not, you cannot uphold a materialist worldview. Do you think that's
yeah, Bernardo Castrov's completely correct when he, in his books, when he talks about materialism as baloney, it's clearly nonsense. It's nonsense from beginning to end.
But if you have to sort of explain this to sort of the lay person, why, in your words, and how would you say that or define that, is materialism baloney?
Well, in essence, because physics has now shown the ultimate ground of the process of reality resides in quantum fields, and quantum fields are immaterial. End of. You can't go around saying, well, the ultimate nature of reality is quantum fields, and then say, but it's matter. No, it's not. You just said it's quantum field. Oh, yeah, I did say it's quantum field, but it's matter as well. Well, where does matter come from? Quantum fields. Are they material? No, they're immaterial. It's just, as I say, it's this one thing over here and something else over here.
And this is what, and this is in essence, I guess, what Schrödinger discovered, right? The quantum field or the wave function.
Yeah, he discovered the wave function, but I mean, the mathematics of the quantum field has developed much after Schrödinger. But yeah, I mean, the wave function, in the discovery of the wave function, there was the discovery of the immaterial ground of the process of reality. But I mean, one thing I will say here is that there is one aspect in which I myself think Bernardo Castro is slightly misleading from my point of view, in that he gives the impression sometimes that the kind of ideas which construct the external world are the same kind of floaty stuff, you've got wandering around your mind when you're doing the washing up. This is not what Buddhism says. It's not what Dzogchen would say. In fact, the kind of mind nature, they call it mind nature or primordial mind, which creates the world and the sentient beings inside it is far more profound.
Hmm.
It's more like a mind energy.
All right.
Does this make sense?
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
read Dzogchen Buddhism, they talk about the kind of the undivided ground potentiality of a mind energy divides itself because of its internal cognizant nature into the fields of the appearance of matter and the sentient beings within. But it's a far more profound, energetic mind nature than what we've got floating around our minds.
Yeah, and who first made this linkage between the wave function quantum fields and Eastern thought and philosophy? Was that Kaprov? But he's already later, right? The Tao of physics.
No, I mean, yeah, Kaprov was the first, I believe, who wrote a book about it of that nature. But I mean, these kind of speculations were hanging around within the discussions with the early quantum physicists. I mean, certainly Pauli was involved with Jung, and there's an article or paper by a guy called Marin, I think his name is, very good one, about the debates between quantum physicists and Eastern philosophy within the early quantum debates. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's called Marin. I can't remember his name, but yeah, they discussed this stuff quite clearly. Stapp talks about Stapp claims that Heisenberg came to the conclusion that material world manifests from an idea realm, and that the quantum realm is a realm of ideas. That's Stapp.
Plato, in essence.
Yes. Well, yes.
Yeah, there's this quote by Heisenberg, I think, that Plato has sort of had it right. I think I came across that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
do you know what Schrödinger, I think you also write about that, what did Schrödinger himself think about the ontological, how to sort of make sense of his equation ontologically?
I get the feeling he was in two minds. Bohr took the path of being inscrutable, and several of the quantum physicists, I mean, when Pauli came out and said quite clearly that he was in line with Heisenberg's idea realm, I think Schrödinger hedged his bets. It's my feeling. I think he lent towards the idea that the quantum wave function was real in some sense, because he aligned himself with Einstein, certainly.
But is that Einstein has this to do with sort of the hidden variables that Einstein just couldn't live with a probabilistic universe in a sense?
The thing which Einstein really didn't like was non-locality, the idea that something happening over here could connect and have an effect on the other side of the universe instantaneously. That made no sense to him whatsoever. But he also said the famous thing, God does not play dice. Yeah, but Einstein was somebody who wanted a real world. And another one was John Bell, who wanted a real world. I mean, John Bell said, I want to live in a real world. And the interesting thing is, when you read them, they don't say, I know I live in a real world. He actually says, I want to live in a real world. Don't give me any of this idealistic Schrödinger wave function nonsense. I want a real world. But he knew at the time the evidence didn't give him a real world. So, and what's interesting, John Bell produced his Bell's inequalities, which then John Clauser, who's also one of the fundamental physics group, showed that quantum theory broke the Bell inequalities thus proving non-locality was correct, and we lived in an unreal world.
Yeah, and
But
I
it all
think this
depends.
is, yeah,
It depends on what you mean by real and unreal as well. You know, again, in Western philosophy and even in quantum debates, people don't say, this is what I mean by real. What do you mean by real? You mean, generally, you mean independent of consciousness. So, I mean,
yeah.
that's the crucial point, There's a world out there independent of consciousness.
That's interesting. Also, this is also stuff I understand, but nice to hear from you explaining it maybe to a larger audience if we use this. How exactly did consciousness encounter, did physics encounter consciousness? In how would you define that? And could we say that consciousness before that time was sort of excluded in Western thought or physics? And then I'm talking, of course, post-Enlightenment.
But as I say, at the end of the 19th century, there's this book, Irreducible Mind, which was published. You know this?
Yeah, I know. I haven't read it, but I know of it.
So, I mean, this is looking at the work of Myers and William James as well. So at the end of the 19th century, there were people who were speculating that matter wasn't all it was made out to be, certainly. And that the material, William James certainly was one of these. Then in the early 20th century, you got Whitehead, who Stapp refers to. My friend Mike Roper is seriously into Whitehead. And Whitehead's view is very close to Yogacara, mind-only Buddhism. But within mainstream physics, of course, it was thought, I mean, what is interesting that if you look at someone like Planck, he didn't believe in atoms. It's extraordinary, because, Dalton came up with his theories of chemistry and atomic weights and so forth, combinations of atoms and compounds with the atomic theory. But even at the beginning of the 20th century, there were physicists who didn't believe it was real. They thought this was just a mathematical fiction by which the world could be described, but it wasn't real. There weren't any atoms actually inside. And Planck was one of those people who didn't believe in atoms. And again, this is extraordinary. People say, well, all these people who think that Buddhism's so great and they've got these insights. It's not. I mean, Buddhism in the early, in the 1st and 2nd century knew that the world was empty of substantiality. There was no Buddhist school of metaphysics which thought there was a real, material world out there. All the schools thought it was either, sort of momentary flashes of existence and consciousness, or the Madhyamaka school thought it was empty of any substance. I mean, they were decades, they were hundreds of years ahead of us philosophically. Anyway,
that's of course very, very fascinating. And what I found interesting to read is that you shared your ideas with Henry Stapp, and he at first was very enthusiastic about sort of the rigor of your approach, but then also distantiated himself, at least that's what I read. Because always people will say, okay, maybe intuitively these yogis, these philosophers of the East 2 millennia ago arrived at these ideas that are very much compatible with quantum theory and the metaphysics of quantum theory. But of course, it can never be as accurate as the math. What would your response be to sort of this general remark, I guess, that a lot of people have?
They weren't interested in mathematics. I mean, it wasn't what they were interested in. They were interested in knowing the ultimate nature of reality. They weren't interested in building computers, or they were just. I mean, again, there's this guy called Jean Bricmont, who's a French physicist. He writes very good, brilliant books, anti-quantum mysticism books. There's one called Quantum Sense and Nonsense. But this is one of his major criticisms. He'll say, well, all these people say, you know, Buddhism knew this stuff before we did, you know. Where's the mathematics? But as far as I know, nobody has claimed that Buddhist philosophers produced the Schrodinger wave equation in the 2nd century AD. They claimed that the metaphysics was known. That the metaphysics of the nature of what seems to be a material world was known, but they weren't interested in producing mathematical equations. It's as simple as that. Just to finish the thing about Planck. Anyway, Planck started off believing the external world was solid, and then towards the end of his life, he clearly stated he thought all matter came from a matrix of mind, and that matter didn't exist in its own right. An extraordinary, complete inversion.
And how did he make that sort of turn? Is that through mathematics or through meditation?
Yeah, I mean, basically the mathematics, if you look at the mathematics of the Schrodinger wave equation and the way so-called collapses, and the evidence of the so-called double slit experiment and experiments like this, and they're carried out in extraordinary combinations, you know, where the essence is that if you know which slit, if you set up the experiment to detect which slit it goes through, you get a particle. And if you set up the experiment not to know, then you get a wave. So it's obvious that your decision, your conscious decision, and this is how Henry Stapp would put it, your conscious decision affects the way the material world manifests. Now, the important point here is that the point at which a lot of quantum mystics push this kind of view into absurdity, they say that human beings are wandering around collapsing wave functions, you know, oh, collapse that wave function, oh, through their intentional, and this is not what it means at all. That it's a collective effect. It's not sentient beings collapsing wave function at whim. And there are people like this guy here, and this guy's plagiarized my book. I'm going to do something about him.
Yeah.
And again, this guy gets accolades from the New Age community. This book is said to be, it's just a mind-blowing, and it's a rip-off of my work. I can prove it. I can prove it. The whole sentences taken from my work.
Unbelievable. You should do something about it. Yeah. Yeah, that's a case.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, he says basically we can collapse wave functions at will. This is nonsense.
And it does harm, right? These ideas. I mean, how would you sort of a movie like
Filmmaker? Completely, because basically, if a physicist comes along and finds somebody saying, "Well, I can collapse a wave function at will," you know, they get very, very irritated. It's why people like Jean Bricmont, you know, goes into paroxysms of despair and anger because he thinks this is nonsense, and it does. It does huge harm, because basically what you have here is schoolboy, in his case he's male, fantasies masquerading as philosophy.
Is that also how you regard a film like What the Bleep Do We Know?
Oh, What the Bleep was a travesty. What the Bleep came out when I was writing, in the final stages, I think, of writing Quantum Buddhism. And I had a very good friend then, who's now in the Philippines, Eric Scothran, who was my debater, and he was he read everything and checked for typos, and also we discussed things every day. It was great help. But we sat down to watch this film expecting, because it's Amit Goswami. Amit Goswami is a good physicist. Again, my friend Mike Roper, who's a highly qualified quantum physicist, tells me that Amit Goswami's book on quantum physics is a brilliant book. So we were expecting something serious. and we were horrified.
Mm.
It does incredible damage. It was, you know, basically, it was childish.
Yeah, that's also how I viewed it, and what I sort of that is, I guess, my purpose is to see if we can make something that is truly accurately scientific, but also because I guess what the film tried to do is engage an audience. What Quantum Enigma also says, to get the skeleton out of the closet, because physicists don't like to share this, right? That it did try, right?
This is true. Now, having said what I've said about it, I don't like the film. I think they could have done a much better job. I mean, they had an opportunity there to do the world a great service. And I think they missed it. But I was at a local Buddhist center called Chithurst, Theravadan Buddhist center, quite a while ago now. And I met somebody and I was berating this film. And he said to me, well, actually, I'm glad about the film, because if I hadn't seen that film, I would have known nothing about this.
Yeah, that's the
but that still doesn't alter my point of view. This guy would have still seen the film if it had been a better version. Now, they did have a chance to do something very good there.
Yeah, and I really...
Can I just finish what I was saying
about...
about...
Yeah, definitely, sure, go
you've
ahead.
got this idea, the problem is this idea that, you know, people are actually, you know, beaming these rays of consciousness, perhaps in wave functions. And one of the reasons I'm really happy with my last two books, one on bone, but the one I'm about to release in about 2 weeks' time, is that I show, I think, pretty clearly that this is not the case. What the case is, it is primordial mind, which is producing both the sentient beings and the material world. And then you must understand that primordial mind is not some kind of, you know, sort of ideally, you know, sort of floaty stuff. It is a deep cognizant energy. It is a quantum energy field of consciousness. And you say, well, why can't we detect it? Because it does the detecting.
Yeah, this is just very hard to grasp. So are you saying that the quantum field is a primordial consciousness? It is an awareness?
Well, let's say in quantum physics, for example, you know, each particle has its own field, and the particle is claimed to be or described as being a perturbation in the field of the particular quantum field. It's a mathematics which goes along with that. I don't know the mathematics. I have a degree in mathematics, but the last time I did serious mathematics was quite a long time ago. I do know about Schrödinger wave equation, but I can't solve it. I mean, this is something which needs to be said. Basically, the idea that we can't solve the Schrödinger wave equation, don't know anything about it, is nonsense. As long as you know what a second order differential equation is and how it gets solved to a first order equation and so forth, you know. But I mean, the actual techniques of solving these things are so complex that unless you're on the ball and you keep your mathematical hand in, you rapidly... I used to solve stuff I couldn't begin to do now. But anyway. So quantum fields are the immaterial fields that when they are disturbed by looking, and you might think, what do you mean looking? Well, this is what Sean Carroll, who's the ultimate many worlds materialist, says. If I look, I disturb the quantum field to get a particle. I can show you where he says it in his book and in his talks. But he will say, oh, I just mean that as a metaphor. No, you don't. If you had a mechanism that you could actually give to us clearly, you wouldn't use the term looking. It's because you don't have a mechanism that you're forced to use this terminology. But anyway, it's another issue.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got to say, well, what is consciousness? You know, if quantum fields are immaterial, where does consciousness come from? But the only place it can come from is quantum fields. And if we're giving, you know, a quantum field to every particle that we find, we might as well give a quantum field to consciousness.
Yeah, so it is consciousness. Am I right to say then that it is consciousness collapsing itself in a way into some?
In a way. In a way. Again, I'm beginning to think the whole idea of the collapse of the wave function may be mistaken. Here's why. Now, if you look at Yogacara Buddhism, this is mind-only Buddhism, which is extraordinary. And the mapping between David Bohm and Yogacara Buddhism is extraordinary. Yogacara Buddhism talks about the Laya Vijnana, the ground consciousness. And the ground consciousness is non-dual. But within the ground consciousness, which is moving through time, shall we say, there are deeper levels which are beyond time. The Laya Vijnana is moving through time. It carries the seeds of all previous karmas, all previous perceptions, all previous activities, all previous karmic actions. Anything that's happened in the past has left a seed of potentiality. And what the Yogacara view is that a moment of subjectivity and objectivity arises from the ground consciousness, constantly giving the illusion of an observer and observed. And it is us grasping onto these as being inherently existent, which actually makes these things have potency for the future. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I can.
It is the act of grasping, which is why in Buddhism it is attached action which leaves karmas.
But this is a collective.
It's a collective
process.
illusion. But no, there are levels. There are levels. Okay? So I mean, so I am not producing my world. This is a collective world that all the millions of sentient beings, including every sentient being I'm, if you like, sharing this material world with, has in the past left the traces for this material world. So I am not, and it's primordial consciousness keeping the whole thing going.
Yeah.
This energy field producing the material world and my own sentient body, but my own sentient mind stream, which has an appearance of a body.
Yeah, it does make sense.
However, I do produce karmic actions for my own reincarnation, or sorry, rebirth. Because I could be reincarnated in God realms or hell realms. But then you've got to understand that within Buddhism, there's no substantial I. There's only a stream of consciousness. So it's not me being reincarnated. I mean, I've had direct experiences of this. In that I've had direct visions from past incarnation as a Tibetan monk, in which I saw in full technicolor visions of Manjushri and meditations which Tibetan monks did in the past. But it doesn't mean that I was back there. It means that some mind stream has access to a mind stream back then.
Yeah, this is fascinating. But this is my lack of knowledge of Buddhism, that I have this naive idea of reincarnation, of like literally me, Hans, sort of having a previous life, but that is put too simply. It's not Hans, right? It's something, it's primordial consciousness, or it's...
No, it is a stream of interconnected consciousness. Now, the way consciousness, I mean, within Buddhism, there are the so-called skandhas, the aggregates. So all psychophysical, the process of psychophysical life is form, feeling, mental factors, discrimination, and consciousness. But consciousness is a stream of consciousness, which gives the appearance of an I. But at the same time, there is, I mean, when this stream of consciousness becomes embodied in a body, there is the appearance of an I functioning, because otherwise, you know, this biological body wouldn't function. But that actual center of operations itself dissolves at death, whereas the karmas continue in an underlying stream. Which is why I can make decisions now to meditate on passion or whatever, to do, you know, good things karmically, which will condition the way that stream of consciousness I'm connected with now will manifest in a future lifetime.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And though I do not understand it fully, but to link it back to the quantum mechanics. I think it was John Wheeler who sort of first put this idea of the participatory universe on the map,
Yeah.
and then one of his students, Wojciech Żurek, coming up with this notion of the epiontic. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on Wheeler and this term and how to sort of interpret it.
Yeah, no, this is in fact, this is one of the issues with this guy who's plagiarized my work, in that he is, in the technical section of his work, where he actually takes my work, he misunderstands it and misrepresents it. So even though he's taking over huge sections of my work, he presents it wrongly. Now, the reason for this is because, in a sense, I was a bit deceived by this term epiontic. Because epiontic seems to mean that the dream stuff, and Zurich does call the stuff dream stuff, that acts of perception create ontology. It's not what Zurich means. And fortunately, I did realize that Zurich was being a bit ambiguous in the same way as Wheeler was ambiguous with this term. Because what Zurich says is that whilst the evidence is that at the quantum level, the choice of alternative resides in our elusive consciousness. Once the material world gets going, it seems that it has its, I can't remember the exact quote, but he says basically once the material world gets going, our consciousness has nothing to do with it. So what he's saying basically is, although when we carry out quantum experiments, it does look as if consciousness is involved. At the level of the material world, the effects of consciousness is washed out. Deal with what does Zurich mean by epiontic? What he means is that there are certain states which make up the external material world, which is stable. But the point is that how do they remain stable, and how do we get information? But what he says basically is that the stable states are kind of moving through this quantum dream stuff. And they force the quantum dream stuff to become less dreamy by decohering them into a more kind of functioning material reality. Although it's still not a real materiality in the way we think it is, but it's not quantum dreaminess anymore, because it's been kind of dealt with, because the decohered states deal with the quantum dreaminess and make them a bit less dreamy. And then there are loads of these quantum states knocking around with information about the material states out there, which actually convey this information to us. We're not getting quantum states in states of superposition, we're getting kind of decohered quantum states that we can deal with. This is in a very kind of crude descriptions what he's saying, but he's not saying that we're wandering around collapsing wave function.
No, that I understand.
He's saying that although the quantum dream stuff does convey information, it does have it is this repository of information. He calls it a kind of advertising billboard of the material world in the decohered states. These decohered states are far less dreamy than superposed full quantum dream stuff.
Graham would be sort of the naive way to sort of just to see if we can, if I understand, but is it the more often, okay, so we don't collapse the world, that I understand, so that the naive consciousness causes collapse interpretation is sort of not, that doesn't go, right? But somehow,
it doesn't. This is where I have this massive point of contention with this guy. So he says the more often we collapse wave functions. I do say that. Now what I do is I'm looking at what Zurich is saying. Well, he's saying at the quantum level consciousness does have an effect. How can this be? Well, if you put it together with Yogacara, Buddhism, and you say, and then you look at what David Bohm talks about, the implicate order. David Bohm says the quantum field is like an implicate order, and the implicate order stores information from what's gone before. And what happens at future times depends upon what's gone before. Stapp says something similar, not quite the same. Stapp basically says every perception leaves a meaning trace, as it were, within the material, the quantum world, meaning trace in the quantum world. So, and then you have Zurich talking about this advertising billboard of the material world, which is decohered. So where does this advertising billboard come from, of decohered stuff out there, of quantum stuff? There was no advertising billboard, presumably, at the Big Bang, when all we had was quantum fields. So where does this come from? Buddhism says it comes from collective karma. So the link between what's happening at the quantum level, where this kind of consciousness is having an effect, keeping the material advertising or the decohered advertising billboard going. It's not the case that I'm directly beaming. It's the fact that primordial awareness is keeping the whole thing going. But my being active in this actually adds to the energy of the whole process. It's far more subtle.
Yeah. But it is super I think it's very meaningful, I guess. Towards the end of the book, you also quote, you sort of, I think, come to more sort of ethical approach, what this all means for our lives. And it gives a lot of meaning. Whereas, I mean, in a materialistic framework, our perceptions, our thoughts are just this byproduct. And when we die, they die, and they never even sort of fully existed. I mean, lots of philosophers even thinking that consciousness is an illusion. So, but in this view, every thought, every intention I have leaves a trace in the universe.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah. And this is fully compatible with...
It's wonderful and scary. My background is not, when I go back and see what I've done in my life, I'm not murdered anyone or anything like that, but, I've been through periods of time when I would not have claimed to be a particularly ethical person, to be quite honest. And when you actually see, when you really understand Buddhism, that this stuff does matter, it is a bit scary.
Yeah, that is.
Which is why, when you look at some of the Tibetan texts, some of these great meditators would say, wake up. stop performing these actions because they will all come back on you.
Oh man, this is this is scary. Yeah. But I'm just Graham. What on earth is the so one of the things that fascinates me is this that these Buddhist thinkers arrived at this metaphysics through introspection, right? Somehow they arrived at these concepts. So, and now we have math, and in the 20th century, these physicists arrive at the same ideas through math. What to make of this? I mean, what's the relationship between math and introspection? Is it just a different symbolic language, sort of approaching a deeper reality?
Well, I can't remember who it was, but one physicist or mathematician once made the remark he couldn't comprehend where the amazing efficiency of maths came from. Well, the efficiency of maths comes from the coherency of consciousness. It's quite clear. You only got, if you understand what Gödel's theorem, the demonstration that, that basically mathematics is based on direct insight of primordial consciousness. And when you understand that primordial consciousness has its own internal cognizant function, it is, because it is cognizant, primordial awareness is a knowing substance. Descartes got this right, in a sense. It is an energy field of cognizant awareness. And because of that, it has its own internal logic. So when we discover maths, we're discovering the internal coherency of consciousness. And you say, well, why did it describe the material world? Because the material world is not material, it's produced by consciousness. Therefore, it would be very strange if the cognizant coherency of consciousness giving rise to maths would not describe the way consciousness produces what appears to be an external realm. The two match because they have a common source. So the fact that math at this level has uncovered the quantum realm of potentiality, I don't find particularly surprising.
And also, it's more the other way around. I think what surprises me is that through introspection it was discovered, or is that my? I mean,
that Buddhist philosophers discovered. This is an extraordinary. Where did their ultimate insights come from?
Exactly.
According to Dzogchen, it's kind of implied that primordial awareness revealed itself to certain people. It's because primordial consciousness somehow is behind the whole process. It somehow has a capacity to reveal itself to certain people. Now, I cannot quote you the scripture where this is the conclusion I've come to. Where else? Basically, it has to have been that these things were somehow. And then you've got to understand, when you go back, have you heard of Julian James? Julian James. Oh, right. This is a whole. See, a lot of people don't know about this stuff. Julian James wrote this amazing book called Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
Oh, great. I'm writing that down.
What Julian James claims is that the Greek poets, the Greek mythology, people producing Greek myths and so forth, did not have the same kind of consciousness we had. they actually heard voices. So when they're writing this stuff down, they're hearing voices because they are being told what to think, sometimes what to say, how to behave. If you go back to so-called primitive tribes, they understand the environment through voices, through mythological voices, and they sometimes use hallucinogenic substances to interact with the voices. What are they doing? They're interacting with primordial mind. Primordial mind has its own internal teaching mechanisms, as it were, for its production. And this, even if you go, do you know someone called Ernst Cassirer? Post-Kantian philosophy, again, the philosophy of symbolic form, all this stuff, I want to write about this stuff. It's so amazing.
It's amazing, yeah. And what it's sort of just an association I would have with it is that people would I'm always thinking with an audience in mind, right? So I can follow you, and then I think, okay, how are we going to get this sort of across, right? Without sort of people thinking, okay, now you've totally lost me because it sounds like woo-woo. But then I think, how did Einstein arrive at this famous vision of his running alongside a light beam, right? That is sort of the vision he had. Where
it's
did
direct
that
insight?
exactly?
Yes.
Where did that came from? And then came the math, just a descriptive language of a vision he had, and somehow we value that language more than the meaning it stands for, right? The vision that sort of preceded it.
Well, Ernst Cassirer wrote these amazing books. I mean, these books were with me all the time when I was at university, 30, 40 years ago, whatever it was. I mean, I discovered Ernst Cassirer, my mind was blown. The philosophy of symbolic forms. The idea is basically that, each kind of culture, when they're cut off from each other, produces their own vocabulary of symbolic forms, which come from a deeper, in primitive cultures, they come from a deeper level of awareness. People who've suddenly been born think, you wouldn't know what plants to eat or any kind of stuff. Where's this information going to come from? It can only come from the symbolic levels of primordial mind. And if you go back to, the writings of anthropologists, and Cassirer goes into this stuff, you will find that they interact with the symbolic forms of the mythical cultures, tell them what it is they should do, what it is they can eat, and the various rituals are rituals of survival. And when you read Judy and James and the idea that these people were talked to, and you understand that probably schizophrenics are actually maybe going back to these kinds of, some schizophrenics will be going back to these levels of primordial mind. When you see all this stuff, and there are people researching this stuff now, it's amazing.
I can follow. I just think as a sort of a more critical question would be, I mean, is then the whole Darwinian story of that would be a process of selection? Is that then a fiction? I mean, or is it, of course, it's both,
nonsense.
Right?
Darwin's nonsense. Darwin has been known to be nonsense for years. The only reason it keeps going is, and I'm going to be absolutely controversial here, academic corruption. The evidence against Darwin should have knocked it on the head decades ago. For example, Darwin, his main rival was a guy called Louis Agassiz. I don't know if I pronounced that right, Agassiz. And he was saying that basically the species were thoughts in the mind of God. Ugh, what nonsense. Okay, put that aside for a moment. Now, Agassiz said individual species will actually evolve according to Darwinian processes. We don't deny that. But the idea that species evolves in this way is just ridiculous. I mean, I've written a book about this. I mean, you go, people are like, oh, for God's sake, I mean, that's Jerry Coyne. Oh, God's sake. At the beginning of his book, Why Darwin is True, or something like this, you know, it's a hair. This hair protects him from the sun. When you think, do you think I'm an idiot? That one hair is going to protect, you think this is nonsense from beginning to end. Now, one of the big shocking discoveries was a thing called Evo-Devo, evolutionary development biology. Because according to Darwin's view, and this is written about by Dawkins, the genes of all animals should be getting further and further apart, which is why Dawkins actually says this in his book, River Out of Eden. And then suddenly they discovered that, you know, we have the same genes as the fly, called Hox genes. And they suddenly discovered that all biological species are built in layers on body plans, which go from the most kind of rarefied, getting more and more complex, but we all share the common structure, which demolished Darwin overnight.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
still, these people go on television and say, well, no, it didn't demolish Darwin, really. Darwin was really right. But, I mean, he just got a few things wrong. No, he didn't. He got everything wrong.
Yeah. But you did say, right, that evolution in a sense is still valid, right? Or in what sense is evolution a...
It operates at a quantum level. Now, you've got to be... So, Evo-Devo biology shows that all species are put together through templates like object-oriented programming, actually. You know about object-oriented programming?
No.
No, right. It's basically you have the most basic object, body, 4 legs, or body, water. You know, it goes from the most kind of abstract, and depending on the environment, it gets more, you know, 4 legs, head, 2 eyes. It gets more and more complex as you go down through the levels of manifestation. And this coincides exactly with quantum theory. Why? Because according to quantum theory, even Stephen Hawking's view, all possible events exist in potentiality at the dawn of time. In which case, all species exist in potentiality at the dawn of time. So they're not random. Which ones actually manifest may be random, because there'll be species who haven't manifested.
And you say, so at the dawn of time, to be bit more precise, we're talking the Big Bang here, or the sort of the start of the universe. All potentiality was already there in this.
At the Big Bang.
Yeah.
If you believe the psychic universe, as Penrose does, then they're there all the time for eternity.
Yeah. Yeah, he believes like in a cyclical universe, right? So a previous Big Bang or a previous aeon. Wow, it's just all amazing stuff. Just
well, see, Amit Goswami talks about the fact that basically what happens is that as the material world evolves from the quantum level, various possible ways in which animals can survive are tested out. In the same way photosynthesis works. You test out, is this template going to work? Yes. So, and it gets more and more complex, and then eventually it manifests onto the apparent material level. And this explains the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
Suddenly all these I mean, again, I'll have to say, I'll claim it for myself. The level of detail in my work is quite extraordinary. I mean,
yeah, I just have to go through it more. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I was researching this stuff every day. This is based on research I did 40 years ago at Sussex University. when I was writing a book called The Self-Referring Universe, in which I was going through all the mythologies, showing you the mythologies, and in some sense had this self-referring system of division and then going down to manifestation. And then when I was writing Quantum Buddhism, we're talking about every day, for 8 to 10 years.
Wow.
I was even writing in my dreams.
Yeah. This is
I was that committed to doing this.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I definitely think these ideas, you're definitely ahead of a lot of people, but it will. I just believe we're not having this conversation for no reason. I mean, this deserves an audience, right? It deserves sort of and I'd love to make a film about all of this. I think that the key to me, sort of thinking from a communication sort of perspective, the key to get it across is that a lot of people, I mean, of course, there are millions of people worldwide who would find this all super fascinating, but like the really large audience, if we think globally, would have to find it, we need sort of a key to make it work in our daily lives, right? So what's the meaning of all of this for my daily life? And I think you have that, right? So is there an ethics to derive from quantum theory and how to get out of this materialist framework?
Well,
sorry, this is just a lot I'm asking, and it's.
Well, no, I've thought about all this stuff. The first thing, for me, this is my personal view, I think it's dangerous to think it's too easy. It's dangerous to think that because you suddenly discovered the material world doesn't exist as it appears, that it's all sort of nice, fluffy, floaty stuff. It's not. I mean, in one of my talks with, I can't remember his name now, Buddhism is not a fluffy religion, and unfortunately there is a tendency, an agenda in the West to turn it into a fluffy religion where it's not. If you read the Lam Rim, it is scary. And it basically says that samsara is not a very pleasant place to be because of the terrible things that can happen. Now, we are incredibly lucky because of what we've done in the past. We've ended up in a very advantageous situation. And Buddhism would say, make sure you stay there by behaving ethically, you know. A lot of people have ended up in very bad situations. Terrible things happen in the world. And, you know, to try and pretend that this is not happening because you've read a few fluffy books, to me, is unethical. You've got to look at what the world really is like. The idea that you can do, you know, a few bits of meditation and you're going to be enlightened is mistaken. However, at the same time, the idea that meditation can take you to a place where you can have experiences of the ultimate depths of reality, to understand that is possibility, that is worth having, and to actually get going doing a meditation practice on the basis of that, and knowing whether you can actually access deeper levels of non-dual mind. Again, depends on your past experiences and even your past lives. Some people wake up quite quickly. I mean, I have had experience. I mean, when you experience, let me put it this way, when you experience the energy of consciousness, it is self-revealing. It is like a crystalline energy sphere of bliss, emptiness, and cognizance. This is what it's called. This is what it is. the first time I contacted it, I thought, it's true. You know, just that.
Yeah,
It
and
just,
yeah, wow, wow. And that was through meditation for you?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I had,
But once you've gone through the level, so you can go there. You can go there quite quickly in meditation.
what's the best way to go through there for the first time? Is that just doing a retreat and like many days of silence?
It may be that for me, believe it or not, I went there by reading a book called Mindfulness, Bliss and Beyond by Ajahn Brahm. And this is jhana meditation.
I'm writing it down, yeah.
I mean, the other thing I would say, one of the reasons I started writing Quantum Buddhism was I had spontaneous meditation experiences when I had these appearances of being surrounded by manjushris and visions of orange nectar going up to the hearts of the manjushris surrounding me. It turned out this was a vision that somebody would have, a practitioner, Tibetan monk practitioner would have prior to writing a book. And at the time I was contemplating writing a book about zero, and it turned into writing a book about shunyata. But I had spontaneous meditation experiences which led me to join a Tibetan Buddhist community, where again I had dreams about walking through walls and talking with Tibetan deities and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And that's how I started writing the book.
Wow. And I guess what a lot of people find difficult, I mean, I come from a Christian background, is of course the duality that they also find sort of comforting, right? To have a sort of universal good and evil. How does that relate to Buddhist thought, and how would you relate it to sort of the metaphysics from quantum theory?
Well, one thing I would say is that when I first got into Buddhism second time round after the meditation experiences and getting into Madhyamaka, emptiness Buddhism, which is what I went to a Gilug Gilug Dharma Center, and their Madhyamaka, which is emptiness. They don't emphasize the mind nature reality. They emphasize emptiness. And I became very kind of almost, I kind of put it, I had kind of downer on Christianity. After doing the research and becoming, I lean more now towards the Yogacara view of primordial awareness being the ultimate nature reality. I don't believe it's emptiness. Emptiness is a doorway. Emptiness, the experience of emptiness is a doorway through to primordial awareness. Because primordial awareness is empty of duality, but it gives rise to duality. But you can understand that what you would call mystical Christianity is very close to Yogacara Buddhism, from my point of view, because it remains the case that there are forces of evil within the layer Vijnana, for instance. You know, there are forces pulling you down, pulling the mind down away from primordial reality. So, I mean, you can make a case that there are meditative traditions in Christianity. There's one called the Hesychasts, for example. And you would find these people very close to Dzogchen Buddhism.
Yeah, or Gnostics. The Gnostics.
Yes, indeed,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I read the book, the Gnostic Bible, or whatever, Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah, by Elaine Pagels. Yeah,
that's the one. Fantastic book.
Yeah,
pretty good. Yeah. But see, I'm pretty convinced that Jesus Christ was a Buddhist mystic. Have you heard of this? You know, there's a book called When Jesus Was in Kashmir or something.
Yeah. I've heard
okay. The three kings were basically people sent out from Tibet looking for the next incarnation of a particular lineage, right? We come and find the young boy. Oh, right, yeah, there he is. There's our new incarnation. He then goes back to Kashmir, and there's a lot of evidence that he hung out in Kashmir for quite a long time. He then comes back to preach Christianity, to preach Buddhism. And if you look at the Ten Commandments, you can see, you know, basically it is, if you like, a Buddhist ethics in the words of Christianity, as it were. He basically, I mean, it's the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, the Trikaya, you know, the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya. You know, why did you get 3 bodies in Christianity and 3 bodies in Buddhism?
Yeah, very interesting.
So I think a lot of his teachings you can map onto mind-only Buddhism.
Very interesting. And could it be sort of?
And he didn't die on the cross. He didn't. When he was on the cross, he wasn't taking the sins of the world. He was taking the sufferings of the world. Now, in Buddhism, there's a thing called Lojong. Lojong is mind training. And in mind training, one of the things you have to do is, if you're suffering, you transform that suffering by imagining you're taking on the sufferings of all beings and transforming it into bliss. This is an exact meditation.
Wow, what's that called?
Lojong. It's one of the meditations in Lojong. Lojong. Lojong training.
Yeah.
Now, if Christ was a 10th level bodhisattva, he would have trained to endure pain. His mind would have been in a state where he could have endured pain for periods of time, and he would practice transforming that pain to taking on the sufferings of the world. And it's this exact training in Lojong, taking on the sufferings of the world.
And it's so beautiful. It feels intuitively so much more true than the whole sort of Protestant idea of having died for our sins. This sort of, you know.
And also the idea in Buddhism is that high-level bodhisattvas, 10th level bodhisattvas, can leave a karmic echo of energy due to their highly realized minds, which people who follow them and actually activate that energy, the energy will actually help their mind streams. Think about this.
Wow, yeah.
In terms of being a follower of Christ and activating Christ within the heart of the follower. This again is within Buddhism. Bodhisattvas, when they actually finally go through to the Dharmakaya, leave energy traces for future generations. That if they make aspiration prayers, heartfelt energy aspiration prayers, to connect to that mind stream, the mind stream energy source will actually activate in the mind stream of the practitioner.
Wow.
You know, all this stuff is absolutely extraordinary.
It's so beautiful. Yeah, it's and it brings me back.
See, what I find interesting about my own incarnation, I don't mean I'm an incarnation of any great person, I mean the fact that I'm here doing this stuff, is that I was always going to be doing this stuff. I had no idea why. You know, even when I was, a teenager, I'd go into bookshops. I was always into reading. I loved reading. And I looked up at Zen books. I had no idea what Zen was. But just somebody would say to me, that is to do with you. You need that book. What? Get that book. And I'd buy the book. I think, what? It's Alan Watts, The Way of Zen. Always I was connected in some way with this stuff. And then you've got no doubt about, I mean, if I'd had some kind of just minor little glimpse of something, it wasn't. It was, you know, I was, even with my open eyes, I could still see the channels of nectar and fulcrum. And I'd never, ever known about that that meditation before. When you have this stuff happen to you, you know without a doubt. But here's the interesting thing, which this is going to be controversial. And I'd be looking at people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and these people who are materialists. And the first thing, the stuff they come out with is not just nonsense. It's philosophical nonsense. Dennett's not a philosopher. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Nothing. He tells silly stories and things. But anyway, I mean, and always I think, how can these people think this way? You know, what's wrong with their consciousness? And one day, it suddenly struck, they don't experience consciousness the same way as you do.
Mm.
That's why.
Yeah. That must be it, or at least it's one explanation. But what wonders me then is that some of these people, well, like for instance, someone like Sam Harris, which is quite an influential voice, right, as a podcaster, but he's in this. He's bending towards, I think, panpsychism a little bit, but
He's a materialist.
It's a materialist. Yeah, he is. But it's also fear. It's fear of. It's a comfortable position. Coming out as an idealist can be damaging to one's career, right? It's and I think that's what Essentia is all about. It's all about sort of just helping this paradigm shift taking place.
Yeah. Also, Sam Harris has. I think there's a big difference now. For example. And again, saying stuff like this is a bit difficult because it sounds as if you're setting yourself up on some kind of pedestal, but I'm not, because there are loads of people who have experiences like this. There are loads of people who experience, what I called, crystalline cognizant awareness of primordial consciousness, right? When I go into meditation, I don't go into some kind of blank space. It is a crystalline purity of luminous cognizant awareness. That's what it is. And it is energetic bliss. And once you've done that, you're aware of it in everyday life as well. That doesn't mean you don't have pain, you don't have problems with your life. My body still aches, and and I'm getting old. My bones are not what they used to be. But this thing is kind of layered on top of this other kind of glowing awareness, and it's there all the time. I don't even think that everybody who does meditation activates that level of awareness. So one has to be very grateful for whatever reason, whatever happened in the past.
Yeah.
I think it's possible to do meditation and go, oh, yes, this is non-dual. Oh, that's nice, but not activate the deep level. And I think somebody who activates, the crystalline awareness of mind, luminous energy, would not think like Sam Harris.
No, I agree. That, to me, what I would like to break open is this. There's the gap we started earlier on, that either you end up with this materialist interpretation of quantum mechanics with this many worlds bullshit, or you're put in the camp of quantum mysticism. And where's the middle ground? And also, where are sort of normal people engaged? Because that I liked about the quantum enigma is that Kuttner and Rosenblum, they argue for show the double slit experiment to like philosophy students, or just show it, because the quantum weirdness doesn't need the complexity of the math to fully understand and to think about philosophically. But we have, what the bleep do we know, trying it, but what we need now is sort of like something that is much more in line with what you are saying, and that's what I hope to make. So Essentia is giving me, yeah.
The one thing I think, and this is something I came to much later after writing, so just recently I got hold of this book by a guy called Rongzong Chokyi Yangzong or somebody, who's a 11th century Dzogchen practitioner. It's an absolutely brilliant book, and he's talking about the fact that there are levels of illusion. Okay, he's saying that basically, although I'm putting this very, very crudely, very, very quickly, he's basically saying, although the material world is an illusion, it's not an illusion in the same way as, say, a rainbow is an illusion, because there are levels of illusion, and some illusions are more profound, more long-lasting, and have much deeper energetic momentum than other illusions. And when I read this, this was the stuff. This is the kind of idealism you need. The bit which, and this kind of would link up far more easily with the quantum theory when you understand that we're dealing with what Dzogchen calls mind nature, which is kind of an energy. It's not just floaty nothingness. It is a deep energetic process of knowing.
Like,
does that make
so
sense?
no, it makes a lot of sense, and because it's also sort of complexity that I need to be able to accept idealism, because a lot of the matter around me is just feels so solid. It's such a strong idea to to say it like that, that you need a theory that can account for those levels. So I fully agree with you. Yeah. Okay, when is the moment that we're taking this field of inspiration, this primordial consciousness? When are we going to take it serious in our scientific method? When are East and West sort of merging in a new science? Or is that just an illusion, and are we always going to say, no, that's the domain of spirituality and that's the domain of science, and science has to do with empirical facts and spirituality has to do with metaphysics, and they can never sort of meet?
At the moment, it looks, see, I can't think of an experiment which could possibly, there are definitely people who are kind of constitutionally anti-spiritual scientific worldviews. It just seems to be that way. Now, on the other hand, I can't remember who it was one of the quantum physicists that said something about, people are never convinced by the evidence, but, the old guard dies out and the new people with new ideas outlive them, kind of thing. That's a possibility. There's a guy called Tom Campbell. You heard of him?
No.
He's worth looking out. Tom Campbell is somebody that somebody said you should look him up. And he wrote a book called My Big Toe. And I disregarded him just because I thought that was such a terrible title. The guy must be a fraud. Anybody who gives their book a title like that can't be taken seriously. And I was mistaken. I was completely mistaken, because I saw him he was interviewed by some guy on YouTube, with a long interview, and he was brilliant. And he is trying to do some kind of fundamental physics group type experiments demonstrating paranormal, which he says will prove certain aspects of the mind-like nature of the quantum realm. And, he's worth looking at.
Wow, I'll definitely.
He's definitely worth looking at.
Because but I know Bernardo is like super cautious with all of this, but I do think for a bigger audience, you need something, and especially for a documentary, you would need something like
But Tom
this.
Campbell, he is a physicist. He is a physicist.
So he's like a Nick Herbert, because Nick Herbert did this,
he's
right?
that kind of guy. He's that kind of guy. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the interview I saw of him was brilliant. He was saying, well, look, in the early days, basically, the consensus was in the Copenhagen interpretation that the nature of reality was more mind-like than matter-like, and matter was a production of mind. He said that was the basic view. And he said, what people, and this is brilliant because it's absolutely true, he said, what physicists have done now is they haven't changed the evidence, because there is no new evidence. What they've done is change the language. So it sounds as if they've got a more materialist world, He said there's no new experiments being done to show anything, any new evidence, but they all come out, they talk about decoherence, or they talk about entanglement, and they use a different language to try and hide the mind aspect away.
And was this like if we draw a parallel to religion, like so in original scripture, if we would like see the notes of the Copenhagen Assembly, it would say like more mind-like than matter-like?
Yeah. Go and get this article it's called by Marin. I'm sure Marin. I can't remember. I've got it somewhere over there, but it's an article on the roots of it, the quantum physics roots in Eastern mysticism, something like that. And yeah,
wow.
If you look at Pauli, what Pauli, Heisenberg, even Schrodinger, I think Schrodinger did have leanings towards Vedanta, I think, Schrodinger, definitely. But I think these people were cautious, but I mean, Heisenberg said, it was an idea-like realm. Pauli was involved with Jung. It was only when people like Bell came along, Bell hated these ideas. But then, as I say, what is interesting, if you read people like Bell, he doesn't say the evidence clearly shows. He says, look, I don't like this evidence, get me some more. And in fact, I've just, this is another book, you really should read this book. Tibetan Book of the Undivided Universe, the definitive book on Bohm and Buddhism. Now, David Bohm was a brilliant mathematician. Now, David Bohm started out as a Marxist materialist, okay? Brilliant mathematician, brilliant quantum physicist, but a materialist. So Einstein went to Bohm and said, look, I want to get rid of this, all this Bohr's mystical stuff. I'm fed up with it. You're good at maths, give me back my real world. And so Bohm then went away and produced a pilot wave theory, which you must have heard of.
Yeah, but you do have to remind me of what it stands for again.
The pilot wave theory says there are these kind of waves which push real particles around the universe. But the particles are real and the pilot waves are real. So particles never suddenly divide up through the slits. It's the pilot wave pushing them, okay? And he transformed the equation so that he came out with his pilot wave theory. And even today, if you read things like What is Real by Becker, I think it is, or Lee Smolin, whatever, they give you the pilot wave theory as a possible realistic theory, but it's not, because in the pilot wave theory, it's only certain quantum particles which are real. Other bits of the quantum realm, like spin, become really weird. They say, in other aspects, the quantum realm, it makes the classical realm even weirder than it was in the first place. It's only, and people still talk about it as if it's a possible classical type, but it's not, because everything else falls into quantum weirdness in the classical realm. And Bohm knew this, so Bohm, he then got involved he started reading Christian mystics, Eastern mystics. He got involved with a guy called Krishnamurti. And he realized very quickly that, that in fact, in order to solve the problems of his pilot wave theory, he had to move it into much more spectacular realm of the implicate order, which is like a realm of immaterial potentiality, which has an internal nature of consciousness. So from trying to fit into Einstein's requirements for a material world, he in fact produced a theory completely consistent with Buddhist Dzogchen, wherein the ultimate nature of reality is primordial awareness and potentiality.
And did he? Was Einstein still alive when Bohm came up with this implicate order?
I don't think he was, no.
Yeah, but what a
Not
story is this? What a story! Yeah, this is really great stuff.
It's not told. You'll not find this story in books because they want to present Bohm's work just a bit, which looks a bit classical.
Yeah.
But Bohm is the man. If you want to look for the two people are a guy, David Bohm. Honestly, get a hold of Mike Roper says this is a definitive book on Bohm and Buddhism. I'm so happy with this book.
The Tibetan book of Undivided Universe, right? You
Book of the
showed it to me.
Undivided Universe, yeah.
Yeah.
Because even I, when I was exploring it, was just amazed. Now, the problem with Bohm is he has been hijacked by New Age people called David Bohm's work was the bee's knees last year. It's presented. The Dalai Lama was involved. Basil Heide, who wrote with David Bohm. And Basil Heide is the guy who actually was David Bohm's collaborator. Mike Roper knows him. Mike Roper knows Basil Heide. So Mike is my friend, moves in these circles. I mean, he's about 70 now, but he was a bit more. But he moved in. He went to conferences with all these people. He knows these people. I think one person in Essentia, is it Bernard Carr?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I've interviewed Bernard Carr. Bernard Carr is Bernard Carr is very much into.
Well, Mike Roper also met Bernard Carr. As I say, he briefly met David Bohm. He knows Basil Heide, and so this man is he's a chartered physicist.
Yeah.
So that's the best you can get. And he has met Bernard Carr. And he said, I should contact Bernard Carr, but I don't like. He said Bernard Carr is a great man in this area of research. He knows what he's talking about. And he says Bernard Carr doesn't like fluffy, imprecise.
Oh, but he should definitely speak to Bernard Carr, because Bernard Carr is now, I guess, retired and has come up with his own, I wouldn't say implicate order. I don't understand it that fully, but he's come up with, Bernard Carr is now plotting like mental realms or dream space, he would call it, on like string theory on higher dimensions, because Bernard Carr has been into psychical research apparently for a long time, but has never sort of come out of the closet until now.
Okay,
so
this is what Mike Roper was telling me about. Yes.
Yeah, and I've interviewed him. It's quite, yeah, he's now all outspoken, so that's really nice. And
but David Bohm, I mean, the two main men in this area are Michael. You won't have heard of this guy, Michael Minsky.
No, Minsky.
Russian physicist Michael Minsky. He produced this thing called the quantum concept of consciousness.
And he is still alive?
No, he's dead, unfortunately. I was connected with a Buddhist philosopher, Russian Buddhist philosopher called Andrei Terentiev, who knew him. But Michael Minsky endorsed the book which I wrote about him, called Quantum Path to Liberation. But unfortunately, he's dead now. But yeah, Michael Minsky, brilliant man. And again, the thing about Michael Minsky, which makes him so important, is I hooked up with Terentiev when I was writing about Michael Minsky. And I said, well, was Minsky a Buddhist, or was he some kind of spiritual guy? He said, no, Michael Minsky was not a member of any particular religion. He just saw that these quantum aspects linked up with quantum theory, and they could only link up. So someone like Michael Minsky, who hasn't got, a iron in the fire, as it were, and he's written lots of brilliant articles about the fact that that precognition, psychic phenomena are predicted by quantum theory.
Yeah, exactly what sort of the fundamental physics group in the 70s tried to sort of
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also wrote down that Tom Campbell, acting with a psychologist now, who has done, that's based on Wigner's friend kind of experiments. I think it's done with like to put someone in a second room who has to sort of who doesn't know if he is being confronted with a signal that is still in superposition or not, and that they see.
Yeah, but you see, Wigner's friend again. You see, you've got to go back. You've got to realise that the idea that it's primordial consciousness,
Mm,
which is driving all this, gets rid of those conundrums,
mm,
because that Wigner's friend is based on the assumption that as individual human beings collapsing wave functions.
yeah, yeah. And then
Once
as
you
a sort of
understand this,
the paradox that there's always someone in an outside room and there's another
yeah,
superposition, right?
yeah,
But
yeah, that kind of thing.
yeah,
So if the guy's inside the room's in a superposition, and I'm talking to a guy out here, when he goes in, does he become superposed as well? And I can't remember what exactly he is, but what the conundrum exactly is. But it's something like that. The person inside the room's in a superposition. What happens to a guy who goes into the room and the guy outside the room? Is it consciousness, your individual consciousness, that collapses the wave function? That is ignorant somehow. And so, who had this idea that it's individual beings collapsing wave functions? So what happens is then, you see, there was a discussion between Sean Carroll and I think it was David Albert, in which David Albert is saying how stupid it is that you have these people like Wigner saying, well, it's a cat or a worm collapsing the wave function. And in fact, it is silly when you think, well, this earthworm is going around collapsing wave functions. But once you realize that this is not what the double slit actually tells you, there's no evidence that individual beings are collapsing the manifest world. All it means is it shows you your consciousness can determine what's happening at the quantum level. But that just means you are actually just setting up the interaction of primordial consciousness with an experiment at the quantum level. You see what I'm saying?
that's what you're saying. So yeah, so your conscious decision in what experiment you do is actually setting up how primordial consciousness interacts with the quantum world, or
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But the only complexity here is that primordial consciousness is, in a sense, the quantum world, right? So it itself.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
what you're seeing is primordial consciousness activating its own potentialities.
yeah. And did John Wheeler understand this? I mean, in
No.
how much of this? No,
No.
Because what was John Wheeler's interpretation of the collapse of the wave function?
Well, Wheeler came close, but he said it's the Wheeler said that it is the collective perceptions of all sentient beings acting backwards in time.
So collectively, by watching it at the world, we are sort of constructing our own history from the Big Bang until this moment.
Yeah.
Is that in line with Buddhist thinking?
Yeah. Well, I mean, whether it's backwards in time, it appears to be backwards in time. But in primordial consciousness, time disappears into potentiality anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just an appearance anyway.
But I do know that Wheeler, I've read this book about science journalist Amanda Gefter, who dived into the diaries of Wheeler, which is quite fascinating.
I know, I've got her book.
Yeah. So and it's quite. It's for me, it was very nice to see this human side that his whole life he struggled with this what he called like the multiple observer problem.
Yeah. And that Amanda Gefter's book is a great book.
Do you know?
Enjoyed
I'm
it.
still because I'm still reading it. Where she ends up? Is she like is she bending towards idealism or still in a?
No, this is the problem. You see, now again, I'm writing about this in my latest book. You see, I think there's this kind of icy grip of the anti-quantum mysticism thought police, which is operating in academic. She writes from New Scientists. She can't come out as a fully fledged quantum mystic, can she?
Okay. Because I was thinking to sort of get her on board for this documentary series, but I mean, it's up to me
She's
how
wavering. I've been watching stuff. She's wavering at the moment.
Yeah.
She's wavering because what she says about Wheeler sometimes, you see, she actually says at one point, but it can't be consciousness. The idea, she actually says in the book, I think, the idea that it's consciousness is bullshit because consciousness is just a production of the brain.
Is what she said?
Yes.
Oh, but that's unbelievable. That's like that's.
Well, you see, this is the grip. She goes on these YouTube discussion channels with people like Michael Shermer, you know.
Yeah.
So she can't. But in the last interview I saw with her, she was wavering a bit, saying, well, Wheeler does say consciousness, but she's kind of wavering between it's not really consciousness, but kind of consciousness, but not really. She doesn't know.
And if you connection or an intro to Roger Penrose, whom I've interviewed, and he's of course not an idealist, but I do think he's he's nuanced in a way, right? He's open about.
He's nuanced. Well, now I tell again, Penrose is somebody else who's hedging his bets. Now, I once thought he was hedging his bets for nefarious reasons. I no longer think that's true. I'm going to do a talk about him. He's hedging his bets because he's not quite sure. He is actually wavering. He doesn't want to believe that consciousness is something valid in its own. He believes there's a bit of physics missing.
Exactly.
That's what he believes. He believes that the quantum materialists are wrong. He thinks consciousness is far more kind of complex.
Yeah.
It's not just atoms banging around. But he doesn't think that consciousness collapses to wave function. He thinks there's a bit of physics missing.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what are the other? Andre Linde is a big name, right?
I don't know much about it. I know that he has said that he thinks that consciousness may have its own degrees of freedom. I think Andre Linde is a good one. If you get Tom, what to say his name? Tom
Campbell.
Yeah, Tom Campbell. If you can get him.
Yeah.
Now, did Jack Sarfati?
It's like he was fundamental physics group, right? Jack
Yes,
Sarfati.
he was.
Yeah.
So he's still around. He's still doing weird stuff.
But Graham, I really love this conversation, and I mean for the story I'm working on right now, but also for like the bigger picture of the research I'm in, and I would just think so thanks for that, and
I enjoyed it. It's fantastic. Loved it.
Great to hear.
I love hooking up with people who are interested in this stuff and knowledgeable.